July 14, 1942, 6 o'clock, Chelyabinsk Tractor Plant, USSR. The morning fog clung to the steel beams of the massive factory like smoke from an unseen fire. Workers moved quickly, boots echoing on the concrete floors, eyes sharp with exhaustion and determination. The air smelled of hot metal, oil, and sweat, a mixture that had become the essence of war production. Giant riveters slammed into armor plates, presses groaned under the weight of hulls, and sparks danced like fireflies around welding stations. Lieutenant Colonel Pavel Sokolov, visiting the plant to inspect production, stepped over a half-finished T-34 chassis. He noted the absence of radio equipment in the turret, the raw steel gleaming where paint should have been, and the rough welds that would have been smoothed under normal circumstances. A worker wiped soot from his face and gave a grim smile. "Comrade Sokolov," the man said, voice tired but proud, "it will run, it will fight. Nothing else matters." Sokolov's eyes swept the line. Hundreds of tanks were rolling off the assembly bays, engines roaring, tracks clanking, ready to be transported east to the front. In the cold efficiency of the factory, there was no time for aesthetics, no room for comfort. Quantity mattered more than perfection. He shook his head slightly, disbelief tugging at him. No radios, no paint? A factory foreman shrugged, gesturing to a line of T-34s that gleamed with raw steel under the morning sun. "We have Germans at our doorstep, comrade. Every day counts." Outside, the city of Chelyabinsk was waking. Smoke from furnaces painted the sky in streaks of gray and orange. The sound of artillery could be faintly heard in the distance, a constant reminder that the front lines were not abstract, they were very real and very close. Inside the plant, the assembly lines never stopped. Workers moved in a carefully orchestrated chaos, welding, fitting engines, and rolling turret sections into place. Radios were omitted entirely, optics replaced with crude placeholders, and the once polished surfaces were left raw. Comfort, coordination, and appearance had been sacrificed in favor of output. Pavel Sokolov watched a team roll a freshly completed T-34 out of the bay. Its tracks groaned against the steel floor as it moved forward, ready for transport. He could see the pride in the workers' faces, but also the anxiety. They knew these machines were far from perfect, yet they would face the German war machine nonetheless. In the corner of the plant, an engineer named Mikhail Petrov muttered to himself, adjusting a turret hatch. "No radios, no optics, and they will still march. Our men will make it work. They always do." Sokolov approached him. "But without communication, without proper paint, won't they be easy targets?" Petrov smiled faintly. "Quantity overwhelms precision. The Germans will aim for perfection. We will aim to endure." Across the factory, the sound of engines starting, gears clanking, and hammers striking metal filled the air. Tanks rolled out in long columns, ready to face a war defined by speed, resilience, and sheer numbers. Every imperfection, every omission, was a conscious sacrifice, one designed to turn the tide of battle through relentless production and overwhelming force. The T-34s were more than machines, they were a statement. Even unfinished, unpainted, and poorly equipped by traditional standards, they embodied a strategy that valued presence over polish, persistence over perfection. Sokolov looked at the line of tanks stretching toward the exit ramps, engines growling like a steel beast awakened. He could hardly believe it. Thousands of tanks, lacking radios, optics, and paint, were about to roll into the front lines. And they would change the war. July 16, 1942, 5:30, near Kharkov, Eastern Front. The morning mist lay thick over the fields, clinging to the mud-caked roads and shattered villages. Columns of T-34 tanks rumbled forward, engines growling, tracks churning up the wet earth. From the German positions on the ridges above, officers squinted at the approaching silhouettes, disbelief etched across their faces. "Unpainted, without radios," muttered Oberleutnant Hans Weber, adjusting his binoculars. "They're sending raw steel into the line?" His comrade, Lieutenant Dietrich Keller, shook his head in incredulity. "Quantity over quality. How can they possibly coordinate?" The Germans had been trained to expect precision, tanks with optics, radios for coordinated attacks, crews fully equipped for communication and strategy. These Soviet machines violated every preconception. Their sheer numbers, rough edges, and simplicity were almost incomprehensible. Inside one T-34, Sergeant Ivan Morozov gripped the controls tightly. The interior was cramped, the absence of a radio noticeable, but he trusted his training and instincts. Beside him, Private Nikolai Semyonov peered out through the narrow slit of the turret, watching the Germans scurry for cover. "Ready?" Morozov asked. Always, Nikolai replied, gripping his machine gun. The column surged forward. Engine roar and the rhythm of tracks on uneven ground filled the air. Dust and smoke mingled with the smell of burning fuel and wet earth. Across the field, German artillery opened fire, shells screaming overhead, but the tanks pressed on, their simplicity allowing for rapid deployment, rapid movement, and an unexpected resilience. From the German trenches, the officers shouted orders to fire. Precision was paramount, yet the T-34s presented a problem unlike anything they had trained for. The lack of radios meant coordination among the Soviet units was unconventional, but surprisingly effective. The crews adapted quickly, signaling with flags, whistles, and prearranged maneuvers. Targets are moving unpredictably, and in numbers we cannot count. Weber shouted. They don't fight like a conventional unit. Keller lowered his binoculars. It's chaos, and yet, somehow, they advance. Morozov's T-34 crested a small ridge, cannon trained on a German machine gun nest. Without waiting for radio commands, he fired. The shell struck true, smashing the emplacement. Nearby tanks followed suit, a wave of uncoordinated precision sweeping across the battlefield. The Germans, expecting a disciplined attack with standard tactics, found themselves overwhelmed by raw momentum and relentless numbers. The absence of paint, optics, or radios no longer seemed like a weakness, it was part of an ecosystem of speed and intimidation. The tank's bare steel reflected sunlight in bursts, momentarily blinding enemy gunners. Crews operated with improvisation that rigid German doctrine could not anticipate. On the ridge, Weber cursed under his breath. They shouldn't be able to do this. Keller nodded grimly. Quantity and determination. They are willing to endure what we cannot predict. Across the battlefield, smoke rose from destroyed emplacements, the ground trembled under the T-34's advance, and German forces began a tentative withdrawal. Each Soviet tank that moved forward embodied a philosophy that valued production, endurance, and adaptability over conventional perfection. Sergeant Morozov glanced at his comrades, chest heaving. We fight with what we have, he said, voice steady. And it is enough. July 17, 1942, 9:45, German Forward Command, Kharkov Sector. Oberleutnant Hans Weber wiped sweat from his brow, eyes still glued to the battlefield. The smoke from destroyed fortifications and burning vehicles hung thick in the morning air, muting the colors of the countryside. For the first time, he felt a gnawing unease. They're tanks, they're everywhere, he muttered, voice low. Unpainted, unarmored in appearance, and yet they keep coming. Colonel Dietrich Keller leaned over the map table, tracing the advancing Soviet lines with his finger. And they adapt faster than our calculations predicted. No radios, no optics, and still coordinated. How? The officers could not comprehend it. German doctrine emphasized precision, communication, and calculated strikes. Every crew was trained to act as part of a network, with radios providing a constant stream of information. But the Soviets had thrown all of that aside. The T-34s, rugged and incomplete, were moving in relentless waves. Commanders improvised on the spot, crews signaled with flags, and tanks moved as if the battlefield itself were their guide. Across the field, Sergeant Ivan Morozov adjusted the angle of his cannon, glancing at a nearby T-34. Its turret hatch was missing the typical optics, yet it had just destroyed an anti-tank gun with a single shot. He saw Private Semyonov signaling with his hand to coordinate an attack on another position. Morozov grinned. No radios, no problem. We fight with what we have. The T-34's simplicity had a side effect the Germans hadn't anticipated: speed. Less equipment meant faster production, faster deployment, and fewer breakdowns. The missing radios and optics, which might have slowed them under normal circumstances, instead made each tank lighter and more agile. Their crews improvised, and the Germans were forced to react to unpredictability. On the German ridge, artillery crews tried to calculate firing solutions, but the massive advancing Soviet tanks moved with a chaotic fluidity. Their numbers alone overwhelmed the precise but limited German forces. Shells struck empty spaces, miscalculations multiplied, and defensive lines began to crumble. Weber's frustration boiled over. We plan for perfection, he shouted, and they do not need it. They move, they adapt, they endure. Keller nodded grimly, scanning the horizon. Quantity, resilience, and improvisation, the Soviet philosophy is a weapon we were unprepared for. Meanwhile, at the Chelyabinsk plant, Foreman Mikhail Petrov's words echoed in Morozov's mind: quantity overwhelms precision. The Germans will aim for perfection. We will aim to endure. Watching the battlefield unfold, it was clear that what seemed like compromises in design, lack of radios, unpainted hulls, missing optics, had become advantages in practice. The T-34s moved forward relentlessly, absorbing hits that would have destroyed lighter or more delicate tanks, overrunning defensive positions. Crews improvised signals, coordinated attacks with hand gestures and prearranged tactics, and exploited gaps in German formations. Every tank, though imperfect, contributed to a broader tide of pressure the Germans could not stop. By midday, German officers were forced to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth: their doctrine of precision could not withstand sheer mass and adaptability. The battlefield was shifting, not because the Soviets had perfected equipment, but because they had perfected endurance, improvisation, and relentless production. Sergeant Morozov glanced at the wreckage behind him. "We are not perfect," he said quietly, "but we are many, and we do not stop." The German command could only watch as their meticulous planning collided with Soviet pragmatism, and for the first time, the idea of control slipped from their grasp. July 20, 1942, 7 o'clock, Chelyabinsk tractor plant, USSR. The factory floor was alive again, the sound of hammers, presses, and engines blending into a metallic symphony. New T-34 hulls rolled into place, their steel unpainted, turrets lacking radios, optics hastily installed or omitted entirely. Workers moved with practiced precision, understanding that speed and quantity mattered more than individual perfection. Foreman Mikhail Petrov inspected a newly completed tank, tapping its bare metal surface. "It may not look polished," he said to a young welder, "but it will reach the front lines faster than any German machine with its fancy radios. Speed saves lives." The young welder nodded, adjusting a turret hatch. "But without optics, how will the crew aim accurately?" Petrov smiled. "They aim with instinct, with experience. The battlefield is messy. Our tanks don't need perfection, they need presence. Every T-34 that reaches the front makes the Germans divide their fire, worry about numbers, and hesitate." In the transport yard, columns of newly completed T-34s were loaded onto trains bound for the Eastern Front. Engineers made final checks, confirming engines ran and tracks were secure. Radios were notably absent, optics crude. Each tank was far from ideal, but each was ready to fight. Lieutenant Colonel Pavel Sokolov oversaw the loading process. "These machines may lack comfort and communication tools," he noted to an assistant, "but we have something the Germans cannot predict: relentless numbers. They cannot destroy what they cannot count." As the trains departed, workers waved to the tanks, knowing they would soon be on the front lines. Their sacrifices, hours of labor, skipped breaks, and relentless pace, had translated into raw, overwhelming force. The T-34s embodied the Soviet philosophy: produce many, accept imperfection, and push forward regardless. On the battlefield, German officers struggled to adapt. Oberleutnant Weber squinted at reconnaissance reports: hundreds of T-34s, advancing in waves, uncoordinated in the traditional sense but impossible to halt. Their simplicity allowed crews to improvise, adapt, and exploit gaps in German lines. "It's absurd," Weber muttered. "No radios, no coordination, no paint, and yet they overwhelm every defensive position." Colonel Keller paced, grim-faced. "They are like a flood. We can aim for perfection, but they cannot be stopped by it. They simply keep coming." Back in the factory, Sokolov walked the assembly line, observing the workers. Sparks flew from welders' torches, presses stamped armor plates, and engines roared to life in the bays. The sheer scale of production amazed him. Tanks would be ready in days, not weeks, because the plant prioritized output over polish. "This is war by volume," Sokolov said, speaking aloud as if to the machines themselves. "Perfection is a luxury. Survival is quantity." Petrov nodded, eyes scanning the line. "And every tank we send to the front makes the Germans recalculate, hesitate, and fear. They are precise, they cannot anticipate chaos in numbers." As the first T-34s arrived at the front lines, the effectiveness of the factory philosophy became clear. Despite missing radios, paint, and advanced optics, the tanks moved relentlessly, absorbed enemy fire, and struck with opportunistic efficiency. Quantity, speed, and adaptability trumped perfection every time. Sokolov watched as a column rolled forward under smoke and fire, engines growling. The unpainted steel reflected the morning sun, a raw and formidable presence. "We may lack luxury," he murmured, "but we have strength in numbers. That is enough." The T-34s, though incomplete, had already begun to overwhelm German expectations, proving that in war, speed and volume could outmatch precision and polish. July 22, 1942, 8:30, German Forward Command, Kharkov Sector. Oberleutnant Hans Weber gripped his binoculars tightly, sweat streaking his dirt-smudged face. Across the muddy fields, columns of unpainted T-34s rumbled forward, engines growling and tracks tearing up the ground. There was no radio chatter coordinating their movement, no uniform formation, no predictable pattern. And yet, every advance struck with relentless efficiency. Weapons positions destroyed, artillery silenced, defensive lines collapsing, Weber muttered, voice tight with frustration. How can this be happening? Colonel Dietrich Keller studied the map, tracing the advancing Soviet units with a trembling finger. They operate differently, he said grimly. No radios, no optics, no polish, and yet they fight as a unit. Adaptable. Unpredictable. Overwhelming. The Germans had been trained for precision. Every attack, every maneuver, relied on coordination through radios, optics, and carefully calculated planning. The T-34s violated all of those assumptions. Their crews improvised signals with flags, whistles, and hand gestures, moving in waves that German calculations could not anticipate. In the field, Sergeant Ivan Morozov crouched in his unpainted tank turret. Smoke from the burning village ahead blurred the landscape. Without radios, his crew relied on prearranged signals and instinct, coordinating their attacks with nearby tanks. Each T-34 moved as part of a swarm rather than a regimented unit. Private Nikolai Semyonov adjusted the tank's main gun and signaled to the next vehicle. Left flank clear, he called. Morozov nodded. A single cannon blast destroyed a German machine gun nest, and the T-34 surged forward. The German defenders were thrown into confusion. Their doctrine expected order, precision, and radio coordination. Instead, they faced tanks that seemed to act unpredictably yet cohesively, striking where least expected and advancing relentlessly in mass. Back at the forward command, Weber slammed a fist on the map table. We've trained for perfection. And they don't even have radios. Keller's face was pale. It doesn't matter. Numbers, speed, resilience, they endure where precision would fail. Their simplicity makes them unpredictable. Reports flooded in, more T-34s arriving from the east, reinforcing the advancing waves. German artillery opened fire, but each shell often struck empty ground as the Soviets adjusted on the move. Their missing optics and radios, once thought to be weaknesses, now contributed to flexibility, allowing them to exploit gaps instantly and adapt faster than the Germans could target them. Meanwhile, in the factory at Chelyabinsk, Foreman Mikhail Petrov's philosophy echoed in every new T-34 rolling off the line: quantity overwhelms precision. Endurance outpaces perfection. As another convoy left the plant, engines roaring, sparks flying from the steel hulls, Petrov nodded to himself. Every tank we send may lack luxuries, he muttered, but it brings us closer to victory. The Germans will aim for perfection, we aim to endure. And at the front, Morozov and his comrades proved it. Wave after wave of T-34s struck relentlessly, unrelenting in their advance, demonstrating that even incomplete, unpolished, and uncoordinated machines could achieve devastating effect when sheer numbers and determination led the charge. The Germans realized, too late, that quantity and adaptability could outmatch precision, and that the Soviet factory philosophy had created an unstoppable force. July 25, 1942, 10:15, Kharkov Frontlines, Eastern Front. The battlefield was a chaotic symphony of smoke, mud, and steel. The T-34s surged forward relentlessly, their engines growling, tracks gouging the earth, and bare metal reflecting the harsh morning sun. German officers scrambled to adjust defenses, issuing orders that relied on doctrine and coordination, but the Soviets were proving impossible to predict. Oberleutnant Hans Weber cursed under his breath, watching a small ridge being overtaken by what seemed like unending waves of unpainted tanks. They shouldn't be able to do this, he shouted. They have no radios. They can't communicate effectively. Colonel Dietrich Keller lowered his binoculars, his face pale. And yet they do. Every unit improvises. Every attack adapts. Their numbers alone force us to respond, divide, and retreat. Inside one of the advancing T-34s, Sergeant Ivan Morozov guided his crew over a cratered road. Private Nikolai Semyonov pointed toward a German anti-tank emplacement hidden among trees. Morozov fired without hesitation. The shell struck true. Move left. Morozov shouted to the next tank, gesturing with his arm. Nearby, Other crews followed similar improvised signals, converging on targets with uncanny timing. Without radios, coordination seemed impossible. Yet the Soviets operated like a living organism, each tank responding to the terrain, the enemy, and its neighbors. The Germans, expecting linear assaults and structured attacks, were unable to adapt quickly enough. At the German forward command, chaos reigned. Reports came in of defensive positions collapsing under the relentless T-34 advance. Artillery units fired at coordinates no longer occupied. Communication lines were jammed with frantic messages as units struggled to respond to a threat that ignored conventional tactics. Weber muttered, "Precision is useless against them." Keller nodded grimly. "They are not perfect, but they are overwhelming. Every incomplete tank, every missing radio, every unpainted hull is part of the tide we cannot stop." Back at Chelyabinsk, Foreman Mikhail Petrov walked the production line, inspecting rows of tanks ready to leave the factory. Sparks flew from welding machines, smoke hung heavy, and engines roared under their own power. Petrov adjusted his cap and muttered, "They are simple, they are fast, they are many. Perfection is for the cautious. Speed and volume are for survival, and they will crush any attempt at precision if we overwhelm them." The philosophy of the factory had proven its worth. Each T-34 delivered was a force multiplier, each missing radio or optic an intentional compromise to accelerate production and ensure presence at the front. The Germans could plan, calculate, and coordinate, but they could not outnumber sheer determination. By late afternoon, the Soviets had breached multiple German defensive lines. Tanks poured into captured villages, crews improvising as needed, their raw numbers rendering German meticulous calculations ineffective. Sergeant Morozov surveyed the field from his turret, smoke curling around him. "We are not perfect," he said quietly, "but we are many. We do not stop. And that is enough." On the German side, officers could only watch in disbelief. Precision, training, and discipline were failing against unpolished, uncoordinated, but inexhaustible waves of Soviet armor. The battlefield had shifted. The turning tide was clear. The Soviet philosophy of production over perfection, speed over polish, and quantity over precision was now dictating the pace of war. July 28, 1942, 2 p.m., Eastern Front, Kharkov sector. The battlefield was scarred by craters and twisted metal. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with the dust kicked up by the relentless advance of T-34s. German officers were in near panic, trying to calculate responses that would never come. The tanks were unpainted, missing radios, lacking advanced optics, but their sheer numbers, combined with adaptive crews, rendered such deficiencies irrelevant. Oberleutnant Hans Weber leaned over his map table, eyes wide. "We expected communication between units, synchronized attacks, something orderly. But these tanks, they improvise. They adapt. And they never stop." Colonel Keller rubbed his temples. "They fight with what they have. We plan for perfection, and they overwhelm us with resilience and numbers. Their simplicity is their advantage." Inside one T-34, Sergeant Ivan Morozov and Private Nikolai Semyonov navigated a ruined village. The lack of radios meant no commands were coming from a central HQ, but the two men relied on prearranged signals, visual cues, and intuition. Their tank fired at an exposed German machine gun nest. A single shot destroyed it. Other T-34s, approaching from multiple angles, converged, completing what might have required a full battalion with coordinated communications in German doctrine. Morozov glanced at Semyonov. "We don't need radios. We have each other, and enough tanks to cover any gap." Semyonov nodded, eyes bright despite the smoke and chaos. "Quantity overwhelms precision," he replied, echoing the mantra from the factory floor. Back at the German command, confusion and disbelief were mounting. Reports indicated that entire sections of their defensive line had collapsed. Attempts to concentrate fire on individual tanks failed because Soviet crews never acted predictably. Units improvised constantly, exploiting gaps in the German lines before precision strikes could be coordinated. Weber slammed a fist on the table. "Every plan we make is useless against them." Keller exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the maps. "It's the numbers, Hans. And the adaptability. They don't fight like a standard army. Their flaws are what make them dangerous." Meanwhile, at Chelyabinsk tractor plant, Foreman Mikhail Petrov oversaw a new batch of tanks being loaded onto trains. Sparks flew from welding machines, smoke curled from furnaces. "These tanks may lack radios or optics," he said to a young engineer, "but each one is a tool of survival. They reach the front faster, hit harder by virtue of numbers, and forced the Germans to miscalculate. The engineer glanced at the unpainted steel hulls, hesitating. And the crews? They improvise, Petrov replied. Adaptability compensates for anything missing. Quantity amplifies it. That is how we fight, and win. On the front lines, the T-34s pressed their advantage. German units, trained for precision warfare, were forced to retreat under pressure from sheer numbers. Improvised tactics, unpainted tanks, and missing equipment, all previously considered disadvantages, now formed an unexpected strategic advantage. Sergeant Morozov climbed down from his turret briefly, surveying the battlefield. We may be imperfect, he said softly, but we are unstoppable when we move together, and that is enough to change the course of this fight. The Germans realized, too late, that perfection cannot always outmatch persistence, improvisation, and overwhelming numbers. The T-34s, raw and unpolished, had become symbols of a philosophy that prioritized survival, speed, and endurance over elegance, and it was winning the war in real time. August 3, 1942, 7:30, German Rear Command, Kharkov Sector. The German High Command huddled in a dimly lit tent, maps spread across a table, pens and markers poised. Reports streamed in from the front lines. Entire defensive positions had collapsed, armored divisions were forced to retreat, and the advancing T-34s showed no signs of slowing. Officers whispered urgently, trying to interpret the chaotic battlefield. Colonel Keller slammed his hand on the map. They're everywhere. Every line we hold is under attack. And it's not just skill, it's numbers. Unstoppable numbers. Oberleutnant Weber adjusted his binoculars, gazing at smoke plumes rising from the distance. We expected them to be organized, reliant on radios, coordinated. But they move as a swarm. Imperfect, raw, and terrifyingly effective. The Germans realized their doctrine of precision warfare, dependent on careful communication and meticulous planning, was being dismantled by sheer mass and improvisation. Every calculation failed to account for the flood of T-34s, engines roaring across terrain with unpolished steel and relentless force. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Sergeant Ivan Morozov and his crew pushed forward through a recently captured village. Their T-34 bore scratches and dents, paint non-existent, optics missing, but it performed without hesitation. Private Nikolai Semyonov signaled to nearby tanks with a hand gesture, and the small column converged to flank a German position. Morozov glanced at the advancing waves of tanks behind them. We may lack radios or Polish, he said, voice steady, but there are too many of us to stop. Semyonov nodded. Quantity overwhelms precision. That is our advantage. Back in Chelyabinsk, Foreman Mikhail Petrov walked along the assembly line, inspecting a new batch of T-34s. The engineers worked tirelessly, welding, fitting engines, and rolling completed hulls toward transport trucks. Every tank we produce, Petrov told a young worker, forces the Germans to split their attention. They plan for precision, and we overwhelm them with volume. Imperfection is our tool when speed and numbers are our weapons. The young worker glanced at a row of tanks, bare metal gleaming under the factory lights. But, no radios? No optics? Petrov smiled. They do not need them all the time. Improvisation and resilience will carry them. The battlefield rewards speed and numbers over Polish. At the front, the T-34s pressed relentlessly. German units attempted counterattacks, but each strike met multiple Soviet tanks advancing simultaneously from unexpected directions. German precision, coordination, and planning were useless against the sheer mass of unpolished tanks moving with relentless momentum. Colonel Keller muttered to Weber, voice strained, "Every line we hold is under siege, and the sheer numbers prevent us from responding effectively. Their imperfections make them unpredictable. They've turned our advantage of precision against us." Weber nodded grimly. Quantity, endurance, and adaptability, these are not flaws, they are weapons. By the end of the day, the German command structure was reeling. Defensive positions that had seemed secure were overrun. Retreats were organized, but they were slow, uncoordinated, and increasingly desperate. Sergeant Morozov, surveying the advancing Soviet columns, felt a mixture of awe and determination. The T-34s, unpolished, unequipped by conventional standards, had become unstoppable. Each tank sent to the front line forced the enemy to stretch thinner, overcommit, and falter. The philosophy of the factory, produce quickly, prioritize quantity, sacrifice perfection, was now a decisive force on the battlefield. The Germans had underestimated what raw numbers, adaptability, and relentless persistence could achieve. The tide was shifting, and the T-34s were at the forefront, proving that in war, simplicity, speed, and mass could triumph over meticulous precision. August 10, 1942, 6 o'clock, Eastern Front, near Kharkov. Dawn broke over a battlefield littered with the remnants of destroyed fortifications, burning vehicles, and the occasional abandoned German tank. The T-34s rolled forward through mud and smoke, unpainted steel glinting in the pale sunlight. Crews inside gripped controls, eyes scanning the horizon, aware that their tanks lacked radios, optics, and Polish, but confident in what they could achieve together. Sergeant Ivan Morozov leaned forward in his turret. "We don't need perfection," he muttered. "We just need to keep moving, keep pushing." Private Nikolai Semyonov adjusted the gunner's sight, a crude piece of glass hastily fitted. "And numbers," he added. "That is our real strength." Across the battlefield, German officers were in turmoil. Every defensive plan, every countermeasure, seemed to crumble under the relentless wave of T-34s. Precision artillery strikes often hit nothing but open ground, communication lines were stretched to the breaking point, and morale among the German ranks was fraying under the sheer pressure of unyielding Soviet numbers. Oberleutnant Hans Weber stared at the approaching column, disbelief etched into his features. "They lack radios, they lack optics, and still they advance as one." Colonel Dietrich Keller shook his head, grim and silent. "It's not about one tank. It's about hundreds, moving, improvising, overwhelming. Their flaws are irrelevant. Their persistence, unstoppable." Back at Chelyabinsk tractor plant, Foreman Mikhail Petrov watched as another convoy of T-34s left the factory. Sparks flew from welding stations, engines roared, and the smell of hot steel filled the air. "One unpolished tank at a time," Petrov said to a young engineer, "and the battlefield changes. Imperfection allows us to produce faster, deploy quicker, and overwhelm the enemy before they can react." The engineer nodded slowly, seeing the logic reflected in the front lines. Tanks without radios, lacking optics, and missing paint were doing what meticulously planned German units could not: survive, advance, and break through. On the front, Morozov's T-34 crested a hill, spotting a retreating German platoon. With a quick signal, nearby tanks fanned out, closing the flank and cutting off escape routes. Improvisation and sheer numbers compensated for every missing tool, every omitted detail. Semyonov glanced at the horizon. "We may be imperfect," he said softly, "but the Germans cannot stop what they cannot predict, what they cannot count." Morozov smiled grimly. "Quantity over precision," he whispered, echoing the mantra from the factory floor. "That is why we survive, and why we win." By midday, German forces were in full retreat, defensive positions abandoned, artillery silenced, and morale shattered. The T-34s continued their advance, engines growling, tracks tearing into the earth. Imperfection had become an advantage, speed and numbers the decisive factors. Colonel Keller, surveying the devastation, muttered to Weber, "We trained for perfection, and they destroyed us with imperfection." Weber's jaw tightened. "They have taught us a lesson we cannot unlearn. Adaptability, resilience, and sheer force of numbers, these are weapons we underestimated." As the sun set over Kharkov, the T-34s continued to roll forward, unpolished, unequipped, but unstoppable. The philosophy that had guided the factories, the prioritization of quantity, speed, and endurance over individual perfection, had proven decisive. From the front lines to the assembly lines, the message was clear. In the brutal arithmetic of war, relentless production and unwavering persistence can triumph over precision and polish. The T-34s, raw and unrefined, had rewritten the rules of armored warfare. August 20, 1942, 6 p.m., Eastern Front, near Kharkov. The battlefield was quieting as night approached, smoke lingering in the air and the smell of burnt metal still thick. Rows of T-34s, scarred from combat but intact, lined the captured positions. Their crews climbed down, exhausted but alert, surveying the destruction wrought by their unpainted, unpolished, and unequipped machines. Sergeant Ivan Morozov wiped soot from his face, looking at the horizon. "We may lack radios, optics, and Polish," he said softly, "but we have something they cannot match: numbers, persistence, and adaptability." Private Nikolai Semyonov nodded. "Our strength is in our presence. Each tank that reaches the front adds to that force. Imperfection is our advantage." Across the Eastern Front, German officers were forced to reconcile a bitter truth. Their doctrine of precision, discipline, and coordination, so carefully drilled, was consistently outmatched by an opponent that embraced speed, volume, and adaptability. The T-34, imperfect and raw, had not only survived but thrived under conditions where more perfect tanks might have faltered. Oberleutnant Hans Weber rubbed his temples. We planned for perfection, but they won with imperfection. Unpainted tanks, lacking radios, crude optics, and yet they dominate. Colonel Keller's eyes were fixed on the battlefield. They forced us to fight a war we could not control. Quantity, adaptability, resilience, these are their real weapons. Our precision counts for nothing against them. Back in Chelyabinsk, Foreman Mikhail Petrov walked along the assembly line, inspecting the new tanks being prepped for transport. Sparks flew from welding torches, engines roared to life, and the smell of hot steel filled the air. These machines are imperfect, he told a young engineer, but they are numerous, fast, and resilient. Every T-34 we send forward forces the Germans to divide, hesitate, and falter. Our philosophy works. The engineer glanced at the unpainted hulls lined up for shipment. And it will keep working. Petrov smiled. As long as we keep producing, yes. Quantity and persistence beat precision when faced with the scale of war. At the front, the T-34 crews rested briefly before preparing for the next advance. Despite missing radios, crude optics, and unpainted hulls, the tanks had become symbols of resilience and overwhelming force. Each machine rolling forward was proof that imperfection, when combined with speed, numbers, and adaptability, could dominate a battlefield. Sergeant Morozov looked over his crew. Remember this, he said, perfection is not what wins battles. Persistence, numbers, and the will to endure, that is what defeats the enemy. As night fell, the T-34s gleamed under the moonlight, raw steel reflecting the stars above. The German forces, exhausted and demoralized, began to understand that their obsession with precision and coordination could not match the Soviet philosophy of relentless production and adaptive tactics. The legacy of the T-34 was no longer just in its armor or armament, it was in the strategy it embodied. Quantity over polish, speed over precision, persistence over perfection. The Soviets had demonstrated that imperfection, wielded with intent and mass, could reshape the battlefield and alter the course of war. The T-34s had proven it. In war, the relentless and numerous often triumph over the meticulous and few.